Hello, Jamie from Inky&Scrappy back with the Ink Road Stamps design team for a mix of stamp sets today featuring Baby on Board and some Crafty Society ones. I had them out on my desk for two totally different purposes, and I was planning on getting some crafty mail out to some friends, and of course, yeah, things happen. Anyway, so I was like, oh, the one stamp on the Crafty Society one says, the craft room is calling and I must go. And of course it reminded me of Yoda and the room of craft is calling and go I must. Yeah, so that was kind of where this whole card started from. So for this one, I had decided I was going to do some ink blending on it, and I wanted to add in that crafty desk background, or your crafty supplies. And so I was gonna keep this one really simple. You could definitely keep this one really simple. So I brought in some VersaFine Onyx black ink, and then I heat set that with some clear embossing powder over the top. Now I did use my Misty for this one. I should have probably used maybe my StampingPro would have worked a little bit better because the paper could have hung out the sides, and I wouldn't have had to move my my paper around in so many different positions to try to get it to fit well, but it ended up working okay. And usually when I do my background stamping, I usually block stamp it, but since this one was such a large image and I was worried, and detailed, I was kind of worried that I might get some bad impressions, and I didn't want to have to start all over. So that was kind of why I used the stamp platform. You will see what I mean when I say I have some issues with the stamp platform later, because I did not clean my stamp in between. I was just hoping for the best. So I did clean it after the fact. I'll throw that on there. So at this point, I had planned on doing some ink blending on the background. I had started with some distress heavyweight cardstock. I had pulled my ink pads out. I only have a couple of the full-size regular ink pads, and I was like, oh, I'll use these ones. Will make a really pretty like sky background, or galaxy style background. And all of a sudden I ended up watercoloring. I will end up speeding this up really quick here, as it took me quite a while to do all of the coloring on this one. That was probably the, intensive part of this one, was definitely creating that background pattern paper. So for ink blending or ink watercoloring, I don't know, how shall I say it? Distress ink watercoloring, a lot of times I use my distress reinkers. I like doing the smush method. It just works well, I think, because you have to add water to it so you don't end up getting a too thick. A non-watered down reinker has resin in it, and so it doesn't dry. I mean, I suppose it will eventually, but it takes a lot longer to dry. So doing it by smushing onto your mat here just kind of works a little bit better. I did try to work in small areas and go from there, keeping a wet on wet color blend in the bigger areas so you don't get a lot of blotchiness. And then of course I did have to come in with a little bit of water to kind of undo some of my oopsies. I did also add, it's okay to add a little bit of other color in there with your watercolor. Just keep that in mind. Now, I hadn't planned on doing alcohol marker coloring at all. That was not my intent. I wasn't going there, right? Well, while I was doing the ink, watercolor in the background, I was like, oh, it'd be really cute to add some pink to those little hearts in there. And then I was like, oh, but then if I add a little pink there, I got to add a little pink over there. And yeah, ultimately I just was like, I knew what was going to happen. I was going to color the rest. So it did actually work. The paper, so the Distress Heavystock, actually worked fairly well for alcohol marker coloring. Maybe not as good as the Express It, and I would say it was similar to Bristol Smooth cardstock for coloring. Bristol Smooth would have probably been the only other way to go with this one, being that I mixed watercolor and alcohol marker coloring, because yeah, It was not intended when I started. So I did show you only a couple of colors there. The rest of them are going to be on my color palettes on my blog, InkyandScrappy.com. They're in the Ohuhu marker blends tab. I think for the most part, like the pink and the bluey purple and the blue, purple, and teal. I think all of those are on the same color palette. And then I brought in that pinky purple just to give me a little bit of a pop of a different color purple, but kind of still trying to keep with that whole pinks, purples, and blues and greens for my, galaxy effect, I guess. Anyways, back to this one. So I have what I want to say I'm going to write on the bottom here just because, I'm going to have to pick apart my stamp. I don't want to cut it apart. I do this a lot with sentiments that I want it to say something different, or I need a letter or a couple of letters. This is kind of how I do it. I usually don't use the Misty, but I was like, I should be able to get, because it worked so well for the background. I was like, yeah, this worked. Yeah. You see the room? Yeah. I was done at that point. Like, it just did not. I was like, okay, yeah. I tried. It wasn't working. I brought out the stamp block, and then I sit there and I go with the, just carefully with my ink block. You're going to see my head a lot because you have to go over the top to make sure it's going to line up perfect or fairly well. And so I just kind of pick and choose my letters as long as I can find the letters that I need in the sentiment to make a different word in that same sentiment. I will use, because I was kind of like, oh, where am I going to find an of? But there was an O and there was an F, so I just made it work. And I tend to do this frequently. It does take a little bit of time, but, ultimately I like the end result. So kind of figuring out spacing on those, and this way I don't have to cut apart a stamp. This one I was not going to cut apart because it's not something that I would use multiple times, switching it up like this. So it was, and it works. The other thing you could do is definitely do a sentiment on your computer and go and print it that way, I guess. Oh, yeah. Those are my tips for you on this one. I don't know. I did use VersaFine Onyx black ink. It tends to stamp best right away. Does that make sense? Like, first stamp impressions usually are good and I don't have to worry about it. Now, I did end up heat setting it. I did not heat set it with clear embossing powder because it took so long to actually do it. I knew that the embossing powder wasn't going to end up sitting, and I did not want to sit there. And I didn't plan on coloring over the top of it when I started, and then I just decided the stark white was going to be too much. And so by heat setting it, I was hoping that I was going to not get too much smudging with the alcohol markers, because VersaFine Onyx Black is not alcohol marker friendly. So keep that in mind. It did probably smear a little bit, but not too much. The other thing that I will say is make sure that your marker is clean if you do end up doing it this way, just because you don't want to ruin your marker by leaving it on there. And usually I do my marker coloring like this with the big end, so I'm not too worried about it. But if that's something that you worry about, especially if you're using Copics, I would, err on the side of caution. So I did decide to pop up my sentiment here. So I'm going to bring in a piece of thick foam tape, and then I will pop my sentiment on there, and then I'm also going to pop Yoda up on this one as well. So then I will just kind of line them up on the bottom. Now, I hadn't originally planned on cutting this one down and mounting it, but I loved that background paper panel so much that I was like, yeah, it's going to be a full-on, background panel one. So I did come in with my white gel pen and added those little white highlights back in his eyes, bringing in that, I think this one is the Nuvo Sparkle pen. It could be the Specktrum Noir Sparkle pen. Any sparkle pen will work. I just added some sparkly bits here and there. Keep in mind that if you get it on your watercolor background, it will reactivate that color. And then something was missing. I mean, if we're going to the room of craft, glitter must be involved. Yes. Yes, glitter must be involved. So Yoda got all sparkly for his craft room adventures. So I just brought in some distress stickles, and then I just use a little bit and then spread it out with the tip. Yeah, I was super pleased with my crafty, glittery Yoda. So I'm just adding a little more details onto the rest of the background here. Just adding a little glitter here and there to kind of make it work. And then, yes, you know, because I didn't have enough glitter, I was like, well, if I add it here and I add it there, well, then I have to add it here and add it there. You know, visual triangles. I did bring in some glossy accents for Yoda's eyes. I love the raised glossy image or the look that it gives them. And, okay, so my sentiment wasn't exactly lined up perfect, right? And so to combat that one, I thought about like cutting the scissors out or cutting the pens out, and maybe, or even like the little roll of twine or, you know, string. I could have cut one of those out from that background panel. Well, not from this background panel, but stamped one and cut one out and put those on there. But I thought bringing in some little clay hearts, and then I just custom colored them to match the coloring on my background here. And then I will just put 3 of them onto my sentiment here, and that will help balance out that little, you know, not quite centering of my sentiment. So there you have it. The room of craft is calling. I go, I must. I love how this one turned out. It was fun. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Keep getting inky. Bye.